Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Archaeology of Connecticut, and here is your state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman. Sarah, how are you?
Good, thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our September show of the Archaeology of Connecticut. We're excited to be back in the studio tonight for the first time in almost a year and a half. We're going to talk tonight about mastodon finds from Connecticut, with a focus on the Farmington or Pope Mastodon, which is the most complete specimen that's ever been found in the state. That mastodon has recently been radiocarbon dated, as has another less complete mastodon from New Britain. And, while the stories of these mastodon finds are fascinating in their own right, their importance becomes even more notable when we consider them in light of recent archaeological finds, which pushed the date of documented human settlement in Connecticut back to at least 12,500 years ago. So as we, for the second half of the program, after we kind of discuss the discoveries of the mastodons, we'll be talking with Dr. David Leslie of AHS Incorporated, who directed the excavations at the Brian D. Jones Paleo-Indian site in Avon. Dave's been on the show before, and we've talked about the Paleo-Indian discoveries in Avon on a couple of other shows. But in this case, we're going to talk about it in the context of the mastodon finds in Connecticut and megafauna, the environment at the end of the last ice age. And we'll discuss a little bit about whether people and mastodons might have once shared the Connecticut landscape. So before we get started, I just want to welcome my co-host, Scott Brady.
Scott, who just walked in because he got stuck in traffic.
And Dave Leslie as well.
Yep, thanks.
Hi, Dave.
Hey.
So I'm just going to start off by kind of giving a little bit of background on the discovery of the Pope or Farmington Mastodon, and we'll take it from there. So the story begins back in the August of 1913, when a remarkable mastodon skeleton was found in an upland swamp in Farmington. It was not the first mastodon found in the state, but it was by far the most complete specimen. And when it was completely excavated, there were really just a few bones and one tusk that were missing. The mastodon was recovered on the property of A.A. Pope, who was the father of Theodate Pope, one of the most famous female architects, and one of the earliest female architects that was ever professional in the United States. So before we get into the discovery, I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the other mastodons that were found before the Pope Mastodon. The first one in Connecticut was found in Sharon. Not much is known about that. The discovery was noted, but the remains themselves have kind of been lost to history. We don't really know what bones were found and what happened to them. Then in Cheshire, during the excavation of the Farmington Canal in 1828, there were some molars found that were in pretty bad shape, and they kind of disintegrated right off the bat. Then in New Britain, in 1833, there were some vertebrae that were found, mastodon vertebrae, when they were digging a small canal for a local company. And then in 1852, our second most complete mastodon specimen was found in New Britain. And this one included some ribs, limb bones, teeth, and that was in a pond excavation. So you'll note that all of these were usually found in some kind of wetland context related to the excavation of ponds, wetlands, bogs, that kind of thing, canals. So the Farmington Mastodon, also known as the Pope Mastodon for the property in which it was found on the Hill-Stead estate. This is now a museum. People can visit it today. It's a beautiful house and grounds. It was a large estate that was over 200 acres. And as I said, it was owned by Alfred Pope, who was an industrialist, and his wife, Ada. So the estate was designed by their daughter, Theodate Pope, who also is well known for designing the Avon Old Farm School. She also founded that institution. And she played an important role in ensuring that the mastodon was properly excavated and studied. So the find was uncovered at the base of Farmington Mountain at the bottom of a peat bog while they were digging to drain a swamp, basically to do some landscaping on the property.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask is, we've talked oftentimes about the techniques that were in place. So, I mean, I know that she's getting active in ensuring that it's being excavated, but I think our listeners should understand that's probably not to the scientific standards that we would hold it today, correct?
To a degree. I mean, at the time, so it was initially found by a group of Italian immigrant laborers who were digging the ditch to drain the swamp. And they came across something that they thought was a big tree stump, and they were working to chop it up and get it out. And then they realized that it was not a tree stump. And there's a story, which I'm certain is apocryphal, that they came screaming to the superintendent, screaming about a black devil that they had found in the swamp. But that was probably added by the media to add some color and draw on, common stereotypes about superstitious and highly strung immigrants. So the superintendent of the Hill-Stead property was a guy named Alan Cook, and he was there that day, and so was his son, who was a young boy. And his son later talked about the event, and he said that it was a lot calmer, that the workers came to his dad, and they said they had pulled out what they thought were some tree roots, but once they were out of the ground, they thought they looked like very large bones. And it was Cook who realized that the bones were likely something old, rare, and very important. So he let the Popes know, and they arranged for their attorney to have a paleontologist from Yale come out to the site and take a look at it. So for the time and for the methods of the time, it was excavated as well as, as well as possibly could be. So the paleontologist's name was Charles Schuchert, and he was from Yale. And they came out and they realized that, yes, in fact, it was a very significant find, that it was an extinct giant mastodon and a very complete specimen at that. So an excavation commenced almost immediately. It took about 2 weeks. They hand excavated everything to try and take care and not damage any more of the bones. The skull did suffer a significant amount of damage when it was mistaken for a tree stump. So they excavated most of the skeleton minus the tusks. They wrapped the major elements in plaster of Paris to stabilize them for transport to the Peabody Museum. And then later in November, after this was over, the workers decided to enlarge the excavation for additional irrigation purposes, and then the tusk was recovered about 23 feet away from the location of the skull. So there was another dig where they recovered a few more elements, including the tusk.
And just one thing that I thought I might mention is that on Scott's point, with the methods for excavation, that plaster of Paris method is still what paleontologists use today when they find large animals like this in the field. So those methods haven't changed a lot either. It's the best way to stabilize large animal bones when you find them.
So they did a pretty good job.
They did.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there something special about where it was found? I know this sounds crazy, but I did time at Home Shopping Network, five years, and one of our favorite selling stories had to do with the Bog Man, and it was a murdered individual that was they found a body in a bog. It was in peat, and they said they were looking for missing persons because they thought this person had been murdered, maybe in the last couple of months, and it turned out it had been a centuries-old body, well preserved because of the nutrients in the soil. Is there something special here going on because of where it was found?
Yeah, I mean, the location in a peat bog, it was actually found under the peat on top of glacial till, but peat bogs produce anaerobic environments, so that lack of oxygen really helps to preserve organic remains in the ground for significant periods of time. And it probably contributed quite a bit to the completeness of the Farmington Mastodon.
I'm wondering too if it also contributed to the death. I mean, maybe this was kind of some severe swampy area where the mastodon got trapped and couldn't free itself, possibly.
Yeah, it's possible. A lot of these finds are found in around bogs and swamps and places like that. And part of that is related to the fact that they're better preserved there. But there does raise a lot of questions about, whether or not they died in those locations. All animals need to drink water. So they spend a lot of time in wet areas. So it's a good possibility, and they could get stuck or bogged down or, I don't know. Dave, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I think this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that paleontologists have made a lot of breakthroughs in the last 40 or 50 years in these studies, of what they call taphonomy. So the preservation of bones and the landscapes of which animals live and where they die, and then where archaeologists or paleontologists find their bones is, and this is going to not sound earth-shattering at all. It's going to make sense. But animals die where they live, right? And so, again, that conclusion makes a lot of sense, right? And mastodons and mammoths, as Sarah was just saying, need water, and they spend a lot of time ranging over large areas, right? Because they need a lot of food too. And so traveling over larger distances means, like you said, Scott, that they might be more likely to fall into what a paleontologist might call a natural death trap or a death accumulation area, like a bog. But of course, as Sarah said, these bogs are the only areas really in the Northeast that are going to preserve these bones. So I think we could imagine probably lots of areas where mammoths and mastodons might have died, but these are the only places that will preserve their remains, these anaerobic environments. But I think it's fair to assume that mammoths and mastodons spent a lot of time around these bogs for water, but also there's some evidence, and we can talk about this in a little bit, based on the stable isotope composition, so the different elements within animals' bones. So, the old adage, you are what you eat, that's true from a chemistry perspective. We can measure the stable isotopic composition of different elements within an animal's bones and figure out the types of things they were eating. There's some evidence that mammoths and mastodons, particularly in this later period in New England, when we get closer to when humans are here, were eating some really sort of different plants than we would expect. And some of those are what are called geophages and sort of herbaceous plants that you find in these swamps. And they can really mess up some of the traditional isotope signatures that geochemists are used to looking at. And so I think there's a number of things happening here with the Pope Mastodon. But I think it's safe to say that we find lots of mastodons or mammoths in these bogs because that's where they lived and that's where they died too.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say we should all be skeptical of explanations that make sense, but in any case.
That's true.
Well, we'll go into diet and environment a little bit more, but I just want to kind of touch on a few more aspects of the story of the discovery of this mastodon. It was a public event. It became incredibly well publicized, both locally and nationally. And, it's one of the most complete that had ever been found in the Northeast, along with the Warren and Cohoes mastodons from New York, which were found in the 19th century. So, this got newspaper coverage across the country. It was well publicized. And within a few days, hundreds of people were scrambling to get onto this property and try to get a look at the excavations and the mastodon bones. So, a fence was built around the excavation, and guides were hired to protect the site as the work continued, as all these people were tromping out to this bog trying to get a look at what was going on. So this was not, a thing that happened quietly. It was very well known. So to give you a little bit more context about where the conditions in which the mastodon was found, going back to what Scott said about the methods, the paleontologists Charles Schuchert and Richard Lull, who also worked at Yale at the Peabody, published this data in the American Journal of Science in 1914. And they described the specimen. They talked about the history of other mastodon finds in Connecticut. They described the site, the environment, the stratigraphy. So they basically talk about how it was found in a shallow trough in a bog, directly on what they called boulder clay, which is what they used to call glacial till. And so it was under 6 to 18 inches of clay without cobbles that encapsulated the mastodon remains above the till. And this, again, probably contributed to that anaerobic environment that helped to preserve the bones. And above this, there were another 30 inches of fine clay with vegetation. And then on top of that was another 18 inches of waterlogged peat, basically, that helped to cap this and preserve it. So it really was an ideal location for preservation.
Well, on that topic, I'm sorry to interrupt, but a listener asked, how do peat bogs form in Connecticut? Where some places where the bogs are located? Are there other areas, other regions? Is this the center part of the state? Is it throughout the state, but in special areas?
I think when, I don't think we should think of this as like, Ireland, right, where you have these huge expansive bogs. I think that here in the Northeast, they're mostly localized. So a peat bog might give the false sense that it's a really huge area. I think these are probably smaller little spots where, a pond or some kind of a small water feature dried up or was capped over. Is that fair, Sarah?
I think so, like kind of a mosaic environment. Dave, do you want to add to this with your background in geology and environmental research?
Yeah. So in this area, so yes, they're not there aren't very many large, expansive peat bogs in Connecticut, and all of the larger or smaller peat bogs that we have, except for those that have been created artificially by people in the last 300 or 400 years, are the result of a complicated dance of glacial recession and modern sort of isostatic rebound. And by that I mean the way that the continental shelf has risen after the glaciers have receded and relieved that weight from the continent. But here specifically, next to the Farmington Mountain, you have an area where there was a moraine. So an edge of a glacier where there was a little bit of a standstill, and that created a little bit more pressure on the landscape. And so it doesn't happen everywhere, but in areas where there's soft parts of the crust, there are depressions. And then as the glaciers recede, it leaves like large ice blocks in those depressions, and those form glacial swamps, like Robbins Swamp, as for instance, a very large glacial swamp in northwestern Connecticut. This is no different. This is a kettle/bog swamp that's the direct result of glacial activity in the area.
A slight departure, but one of the things that we've learned about that property, because there was a golf archaeologist attached to the museum, and they know that there were at least 6 golf holes at one point during Alfred's ownership of the land. Did the find interrupt Alfred's golf game? If so, that's the real headline right there.
That's right.
I think he was ill when the Mastodon was found, but I think Sarah might know the history better than I do.
Yeah, I think he actually passed away a couple weeks before they found it. So I don't know if he was still playing golf.
Maybe in spirit.
There you go.
So, despite the fact that this mastodon made such a splash when it was first found and it got all this press coverage and all these people traveled out there to try and see it, after it was excavated, it kind of fell off the radar for a really long time. So the bones initially went to Yale. The scientists did their publication in 1914, and then they returned them to the popes, and they basically just remained in crates in a barn until 1946 in Farmington. And that was the year that Theodate Pope passed away. And she had always wanted to put the mastodon on display in Farmington, but it just never happened, which is kind of sad. So then in 1951, Yale wanted it back. In 1956, they found it in the Avon Old Farms basement. So it kind of was just packed away and forgotten for a while. And then it basically nothing happened until the 70s when the Connecticut Geological and Natural History Survey of Wesley and Yale collected the bones. And again, nothing. They're basically just in storage. They remain in storage until 1979, when finally they go on exhibit at the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, which at the time was AIAI. Oh boy.
Yeah, I forget that.
I can't remember.
can only remember the new one.
It's IAIS now. It used to be AIAI, but it's known as the Institute, and it's in Washington, Connecticut. So in 1979, they have an exhibit, and it stays on exhibit there, at least parts of the mastodon. It's not put together and articulated like you see some of them really complete specimens in museums. That's actually never been done with this specimen. It's just bones kind of in cases that people can look at. And it stays on exhibit there for a while until 1989 when it goes to UConn and it goes into the collections of the Museum of Natural History, the State Museum of Natural History. In 2015, there was another short exhibit back at the Institute. And now they're back at UConn again in storage, just waiting for a chance to be exhibited with, the long-term goal of getting a new physical space for the Museum of Natural History and putting this incredible, paleontological find back on display. So it's kind of had a kind of a sad history in a lot of ways. So, given all of this, when it was returned to UConn, my predecessor, Brian Jones, was the state archaeologist, and he was really interested in the mastodon. And he decided that it was time to get it dated, to get a good radiocarbon date on the mastodon. So he worked with Matthew Bullinger, who had dated the New Britain mastodon, to get a date on the Pope Mastodon in 2015 and 2016. So the way they did this was, over the years, various things had been done to this specimen. It had been shellacked and glued and all kinds of horrible things that you wouldn't do under modern conservation standards. So what they had to do was they found a broken tusk fragment, and they sanded it down to remove any traces of glue or any other chemicals that had been applied to the bones in the past. And they were able to extract collagen from the tusk. And collagen is a component of bone that has mechanical functions, providing elasticity and structure for the component tissues, and it's a good material for radiocarbon dating. So they were able to extract the collagen and send it away for a radiocarbon date. And it came back with a calibrated age of 14,900 to 14,200 years, calendar BP. So the New Britain mastodon is actually quite a bit younger. That one was dated to 13,100 to about 12,900 years, calendar BP. So it's a little bit younger. But, the really interesting thing about these dates is that it pushes these mastodons close to the time when we now know that humans were occupying the environment here in Connecticut, occupying the landscape here in Connecticut.
And, it's really not that far removed from the landscape being glaciated, is it? I mean, that's a pretty rapid development of the landscape after the glacier retreats.
Yeah, I mean, once the glaciers start to retreat, plants are moving in very quickly. And Dave can talk a little bit about the succession and the process of that, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, so the basic story is that around 18,000 years ago, so for those calendar estimates that Sarah was talking about, that's when you start to see the glaciers begin to recede. Right, and so that's the glacier then is at its maximum extent somewhere a little bit south of Block Island, covering most of the Northeast. And by about 16,000 years ago, the glaciers have receded north of Connecticut into Massachusetts or farther north into New York or Vermont and New Hampshire. And so what you have in some of the river valleys are some pretty big lakes, so like Glacial Lake Hitchcock and Glacial Lake Farmington. Imagine big ice-dammed valleys of these river valleys today with lakes that filled those rift valleys. So very deep lakes that persist for another 500, 1,000 years. And by about 16,000 to 15,800, those dams fail, and it would have been a lot to see, but billions upon billions upon billions of gallons of water rush out, and the rivers sort of take shape. They probably don't take their modern form for quite some time, another 400, 500 years, but by that point, you're starting to get to around 15,500 to 15,000 years ago, and environments are starting, the vegetative regimes are starting to move in. And so we think first it was probably a tundra, sort of grassland environment, although there are some glacial geologists who suggest that at the edges of these glaciers, you have these nitrogen depressions that actually would have been pretty productive for plants. And so you might have a sort of rich ecological community at the edge of some of these glaciers as they retreat. But then pretty quickly after that, you start to see a boreal forest move into southern New England, and that's the habitat that begins to attract mastodons, is the boreal forest. Those are the plants that they eat. Mammoths are attracted to that tundra grassland. That's the sort of that's the environment that they're attracted to. And so the mammoths are here slightly before the mastodons. And while you see them in the New York area and farther west in Ohio a little bit earlier, it's very shortly after they're found there that you find them here too. And so some of these big rivers that I was talking about weren't really barriers to these large megafauna coming into New England, nor were they barriers to the plants, which move in quite rapidly. And so over the next couple of thousand years, I would say that the environment was quite dynamic in southern New England, with a rapidly changing and warming climate of a tundra and then a boreal forest with some hints of deciduous forest. So you find oak and other sort of hardwood trees, sometimes at Paleo-Indian sites too. So we start to see hints of the deciduous forest, although it's mostly boreal. And so that's sort of just a quick snapshot of the environments and how quickly they're changing, but then how quickly they're attracting animal communities too. And so one thing to think about is how quick, we just had hurricane, I don't know if it was a hurricane, but Henri, right? Come in through this area with massive, massive winds, right? And it happened in the late summer, in the fall, and if anybody's backyard is like mine, there are thousands upon thousands of acorns that were dropped right here. And I don't think they all came from locally. They move around a lot in the wind, right? Trees can reproduce and jump over hundreds of miles with one event like that. And so that's how, in a barren landscape, you can start to get a vegetative community within the blink of an eye from a radiocarbon dating perspective. Storms like that can really propagate and spread those environments.
If I could just jump in, folks, this in from a listener. This is fascinating, enjoying the geology and glaciation details. One more question. How many mastodons have been found in the region, and in parens, modern Connecticut and nearby?
I don't have an exact count. So we've got about 5 or 6 individual finds in Connecticut, although, as I said before, most of those are really fragmentary. Numerous finds in New York, including the Cohoes and Warren mastodons, both of which are very complete and both come from the Hudson Valley. A number have been found in Massachusetts and also northern New England. Also, there's been several instances of teeth, particularly being dredged up in like fishermen's nets and things like that in the water, because you have to think about the coastlines being very different back when these megafauna, roam the area than they are today. So a lot of their habitat is now actually underwater. I don't know if you have a tighter count of that, Dave. I know we were talking about it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, they're rare, right? It's not that they were rare on the landscape, but these are large animals, so they're not as there's not as many of them on the landscape as there would be caribou or deer today or deer in the past before European colonization. I mean, the environment can't support thousands upon thousands of them. They're here in what looks like pretty stable numbers until the environment starts to change, or maybe some other things are happening too. But we find them throughout New England and the Northeast, but in relatively small numbers. And I think that point that Sarah just made is important to think about offshore, right? With lowered sea levels, a lot of these animals were probably enjoying what was a very nice Long Island Sound river valley too, right? That would have been a really lush productive environment 14,000, 15,000 years ago, too. And so probably a lot of them lived there, and that's why it's so hard to find some of them, too.
And I think the other thing, and you pointed that out specifically with the Connecticut specimens, but a lot of these are very fragmentary. It might just be a tooth or a few bones. They're not as
sure. They don't preserve very well in the Northeast because the soils are incredibly acidic.
Right.
Yes. So just to kind of go back and touch on a couple of things, we talked about the boreal forest a lot without really explaining it. And that's sort of, if you think of the taiga kind of landscape, dominated by conifers with, scattered deciduous trees, lots of shrubs, mosses, herbs, berries. And there's remnants of this forest in very, very high elevations in New York and New England. So at the tops of some of the higher mountains in the Adirondacks, for instance, you have remnant kind of boreal forest, little pockets of that. Just to kind of clarify what we're talking about. And, this vegetation didn't just create a habitat for mastodons and megafauna. Other animals also moved into the area at this time as well. As Dave mentioned, caribou, but also animals like bears, wolves, and a lot of smaller animals as well. And that really kind of sets the stage for a productive environment that could eventually attract humans to the area. I was thinking that maybe, because we are going to talk a little bit about mammoths as well as mastodons as we get through the program, that maybe we should kind of talk about the two species and how they're different, the two animals, because I think that's something that a lot of people, don't necessarily have a good grasp on how these two.
It confuses me.
Yeah,
I have to think about it.
Yeah. So, mammoth and mastodons are found across North America, and their habitats overlap, but there are far more mammoths in the west and mastodons in the east. So mastodons are a distant relative of modern elephants. They were adapted primarily to the eastern forest habitat, and they look different than mammoths. They have a flatter head. They have straight tusks as opposed to the big curved ones that you see with the mammoths. And they have different teeth. Their teeth have high ridges, meant to browse the spruce forest environment and consume like woody vegetation like sticks and twigs and brush. On the other hand, mammoths are far more closely related to modern elephants. They have, if you see them side by side, where the mastodons have a flat head, the mammoths have this like big bony knob on the top of their head. If you think about the Ice Age cartoon as that's a mammoth. And they have, a bulbous protrusion of bone up there and curved tusks. They live primarily in grasslands, and their teeth reflect that. They have flat teeth to create a grinding surface for grazing on, grasses and things like that. So there are a lot of morphological differences between the two and different adaptations to different environments. So they do overlap in the Northeast. There are finds of both types, but by far you have more mastodons in the east and mammoths in the west.
So they've specialized enough that they shouldn't be competing against each other on the landscape, right? Because we're looking at a forest, forest, trees, brush, low-hanging branches versus grasslands.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that they would have, different niches, different habitats that they would prefer, that they would flourish in, yeah. So kind of taking it from there and talking about, this changing environment and the different species, the plants and animals, the pockets of deciduous vegetation, and what's moving in. What is that? How does that relate to the first human settlers in Connecticut? So Dave, as our resident Paleo-Indian expert, can you give us a little bit of rundown as right now, what the story is on the first settlers in Connecticut and how close they were in time and space to these megafauna?
Sure. So we've talked a little bit about the deglaciation of the Northeast, right? So as the glaciers receded and then the tundra and then boreal forest moved in, we start to have really clear-cut evidence for these megafauna and animal communities by 15,000 years ago. To date, we don't really have a lot of good evidence for people in the region until in the Northeast. The earliest evidence is about 13,000 years ago at the earliest, and that's far to the south in Pennsylvania and the New Jersey area at a site called Shawnee-Minisink. There's some evidence maybe in northern New England at the Vale site in Maine that they were there around then 12,800, 12,900, although the radiocarbon dating for that site is a bit older, and so it has a larger standard of error. But the earliest good evidence in New England comes from a site called Tennant Swamp in Keene, New Hampshire, so sort of, in the middle of New England, certainly not in the most southern parts where it would have been a little bit warmer, at about 12,800 years old. So, I think that 13,000-year-old date is pretty good for when people start to move in to the region. Could it be a little bit earlier? Probably. I'm sure that we don't have evidence of the very first people in the region, but it doesn't seem to be like there's a lot of evidence for much earlier occupations before 13,000 years ago. Here in Connecticut, the oldest occupations are at the Brian D. Jones site in Avon, Connecticut, where we have good evidence for people when you calibrate the radiocarbon dates to almost 12,700 years ago, but as young as 12,480 years ago. So about a 300-year window. We could call that more like 12,500, 550. So a bit younger than some of those earlier sites. And so that's when the boreal forest is well established within New England. And it's not, so we've been talking about mammoths and mastodons, but probably the animals that Paleo-Indians were most likely hunting most of the time were caribou. And so there's good evidence at a number of sites that it's the caribou that people are following the migratory herds, hunting those, really specializing in hunting caribou, as well as a number of other daily activities. So hunting smaller game like snowshoe hares, reptiles like turtles, birds as well. And of course, not to mention seasonally available wild fruits and other sort of plants that you might find in some of these wetland communities. So they're practicing really a number of different foraging activities, but mostly what we see from the technology and the limited evidence from animal remains that have been found at Paleo-Indian sites is that they are specialized in hunting these large cervids. So that doesn't necessarily have to just be caribou. It could be elk. It could be moose as well. But it is mostly those animals and not necessarily mastodons and mammoths. And that was the story for a long time in New England because most of the radiocarbon dates for these mammoths and mastodons suggested that they went extinct regionally, around the time when people got here. So maybe right at the same time or a little bit before. But there's been some new evidence that was published just last year by a couple of scholars at Dartmouth College. And I don't know, Sarah, if you want to jump in here with that evidence, but it's really, really exciting. And I think it's going to change sort of the way we think of these human megafaunal relationships here in New England, at least.
Yeah, so last year there was a paper published on the Mount Holly mammoth, which is actually Vermont's state fossil. I didn't even know states had a state fossil.
I didn't either. I should know that.
We do.
Yes,
we have one
sure
too,
we do.
but it's the dinosaur trace footprint.
Yeah,
well,
okay.
I mean, that makes sense. That's fine.
They're pretty cool. You should go see them if you haven't, all the listeners.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, it's a great dinosaur state park is great. But sorry to interrupt.
It's fine. We can talk about dinosaurs a little bit.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the Mount Holly mammoth is Vermont state fossil, and it was found even earlier than the Farmington mastodon. It was discovered back in 1848 in the Green Mountains when laborers were building a railroad. So, like all the other ones, they were mostly found during these big construction projects. It was fragmented. It included a molar, a couple of tusks, and some bones. It got kind of passed around and jumbled up with a lot of, with some other mammoth fossils. And for a long time, people weren't sure exactly, which bones were the Mount Holly mastodon and which ones weren't. So to get a date on it, you wouldn't necessarily be certain that you were dating that specimen or a different one, and you didn't know where it came from. So, however, these two researchers from Dartmouth actually came across a separate bone that had been taken away by someone as a souvenir, and ended up in a different museum collection, but it was labeled with all kinds of context information and things. So they felt pretty confident that actually was part of the Mount Holly mammoth, and they had that dated. And it came back with a calibrated date of 12,800 years old, putting it right there with the earliest, human habitation sites in the region, which is really exciting. It's the same age as the Tennant Swamp site. So in southern New Hampshire. So it's really, pushing the possibility forward as more data comes to light, right? Because you have to think we don't have that many dated mammoths and mastodons, and we don't have that many well-dated Paleo-Indian sites. So as these inventories of dates get better, and as more finds old finds are dated and new sites are discovered, we're getting more and more information that are kind of pushing these two habitations closer together. So I guess that raises the question of, what would interactions with mammoths and mastodons on the landscape look like for human populations in this region? At the moment, we have no solid archaeological evidence that it happened. Out west and in other places, we know that people occasionally hunted mammoths and mastodons because they've found kill sites. They've found, mammoths and mastodons with spear points stuck in them. There's a really interesting one from Washington State at the Manus site where they actually found a spear point made of mammoth bone stuck in a mammoth rib. So not only were they hunting these animals, they were actually using their bones, to make tools and things like that. Let's talk a little bit about how those interactions might have played out, and what humans might have done if they had encountered a mammoth or
Run the other way
in the landscape. You want to take that, Dave?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, like Sarah said, and that example from Washington State is really interesting because it's a little bit older than what people think should be Clovis technology too. So it would suggest possible pre-Clovis predation of mammoths and or megafauna, of mastodons in that case.
Yeah, sorry, I think that dates 1308.
Yeah, so a little bit earlier, which is there are a number of early dates on the West Coast suggesting that people maybe traveled to North and South America via canoes and boats along the coast a little bit earlier than what we think of the sort of major migration of pre-Paleo-Indians or Clovis era groups around 13,000 years ago. To circle back to what Sarah was talking about, there's certainly a better history of overlap with megafauna in the Great Lakes region, in the Northwest region, in the American Southwest region too, of North America. And so we know that people overlap for significant time periods with megafauna in those regions, whereas here it's been circumstantial evidence until that paper by De Silva and Kitchell, or Kitchell and De Silva, showed that they did overlap in New England. And even with that, so again, we don't have Paleo-Indian sites are rare on the landscape, right? We think of small groups of people, small populations over a vast continent, two continents really. And so they leave a patchwork and piecemeal evidence of their past, which is difficult to find for a number of reasons. Sometimes, as in the Brian Jones site, they're deeply buried, 5 to 8 feet below the ground surface. Other times, places where people have been 13,000 years ago are good places to be 5,000 years ago and 500 years ago and 200 years ago, right? You have cities built on top of some of these sites, and so they're hard to find. But even so, we have a really good sample of Paleo-Indian sites across North America. And yet, of limited evidence, I mean, there is evidence, there is good evidence that people did hunt and process, kill mammoths and mastodons, but they did so in relatively small numbers. They were mostly specializing, as I said, in caribou or out west in bison, and really bison migrate into the area from Eurasia at some point, and really at like 15 to 14,000 years ago start, I think, out competing lots of these other megafauna too. And so that's a possibility as to why you see megafauna decline. It's not necessarily overhunting by people or climate change even. It could be over competition from other large ruminant or animals that eat similar plants. But they do hunt them, and they do, there's good evidence from, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, just give me a second, the La Prelle Mammoth site out in Wyoming, where it's an old site that was excavated in the 80s, but recent excavations by Suravel have found good evidence, including some circumstantial but interesting protein residue. So actual blood proteins of elephants, and by elephants we mean mammoths or mastodons, found on one of the artifacts, and also use wear suggesting scraping of hides that would be consistent with processing some of these animals. But I think it's a fair question to ask: how would people hunt an animal that is about 100 times bigger than them, right? And that's how much these bull mastodons or mammoths would have been, is about 100 times bigger than a person. And so they would have done it, we think, communally. So lots of people together, probably using what are called spear throwers or atlatls. So the telltale sign of these Paleo-Indian sites are those large spear points, right, that were hafted onto javelin darts that are thought to have been between 5 or 10 feet long, that are hooked to a spear thrower, which allows you to project it at deadly speeds and accuracy. But it still would have been difficult.
But from a safe distance.
Yeah, from a safe distance. It allows you to hunt these animals from farther away, but they're big and powerful and they can charge, right? So, I bet that they could close those distances quickly. And so I think there's a number of reasons why it's not something that we see that's common, even where people did overlap for over 1,000 years with some of these animals before they start to go extinct, which is something that we haven't talked about, right? I mean, but obviously we all know that there are no more mammoths or mastodons or some of these megafauna from this last gasp of the last ice age. They're gone. And there have been a number of theories as to why that is. Many of them deal with changes in the climate that are due then to cyclical changes in the Earth's orbit. And so that's what's driving sort of the ice ages and the warming periods. And so the idea is that as the climate changed, you start to see into this warming period that we're living in, although it's clearly been accelerated by modern activities, that you see megafauna go extinct because of that. People, rightly so, I think, have said, well, what about the 17 previous ice ages where the climate changed and mammoths and mastodons seem to do just fine? And so that's, I think, a fair point. It's hard to divorce people on this landscape in North and South America who get here right at the same time these animals go extinct, right? There's some good evidence that Jack Broughton and Elec Wetzel published a couple of years ago, where they pooled a bunch of radiocarbon dates of human occupations across North America and radiocarbon dates of megafauna, and found that there were statistical relationships that seemed suggestive of increases in populations of people and decreases in populations of some of these megafauna. But they also highlighted that other thing that I mentioned, the increase in the bison, even though people are increasing and they're continually preying upon bison. So there are a number of things that can happen to an ecological food chain that can throw off the balance, right? And so it could be that, yes, humans are preying upon these animals somewhat and stressing them, but it could also be stresses that humans are causing unintended consequences by preying on caribou more, by preying on bison more, or other animals. They're throwing in, a chain of events that eventually leads to the extinction of some of these animals, whether by direct predation, which they clearly did some of, or through indirect predation. And so there's a number of scenarios, and I don't think that we have concrete answers yet to any of them. But we do know that in other parts of the country, people did hunt and kill these megafauna. And now with Kitchell and De Silva's publication of the Hawley Mammoth, I think it incredibly likely that they may have done so here in New England, too. And there are some other ideas people have about this. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to bring those up in the region about the reasons we find mammoths in bogs. Some people have suggested that it's because people were using them, that people were storing their kills of mammoths and mastodons meat like a meat locker or a cooler in these bogs. I don't find that argument particularly convincing, mostly because there haven't been any clear evidence of stone tools directly associated in the Northeast with mammoths and mastodons, except for possibly at the Hiscock site in New York. And so if they were butchering animals and storing them in swamps to cool them down, I would expect them to leave behind stone tools and scrapers and sort of the artifacts that they don't care enough to take with them like we find at all their other sites. And I also just don't think it's very convincing. Ethnographic studies suggest that people were probably, when they hunted large animals, any excess meat was probably smoked into beef jerky or pemmican, things like that. And I think that's probably a likely scenario. If you were to kill an animal that was 100 times larger than you, you wouldn't necessarily store it in a swamp to rot and attract other large predators like dire wolves, which can be dangerous. Although maybe they were not in this area. There's been no dire wolves found in New England. But I think it's more likely that you would dry them and store them as jerky and take them with you. Or maybe store them in a storage pit, which, again, there's better evidence for archaeologically and ethnographically.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that another thing to consider, at least in this region, and it might not hold true across the nation, at least, in different environments and in places where we know that humans were preying on these animals. Here, it really seems like we have a situation where the same environmental characteristics that are making the region more and more hospitable to humans are making it less and less hospitable to these megafauna. So it may be, some combination of environmental factors and human presence on the landscape that are, really kind of pushing these animals that are already stressed to the brink. And I think that there was some indication of just how stressed they were towards the end of their existence, because along with the date on the Mount Hawley mammoth, they also did stable isotope analyses. We talked about a little bit about this earlier on, and the nitrogen levels in the Mount Hawley mammoth really suggested a diet that, was not one that it was well adapted to, that it was kind of having to branch out and eat less kind of suitable vegetation, and was probably, pretty stressed nutritionally. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that isotopic work that they did is really, really interesting. So on one hand, like Sarah said, you have the youngest mammoth or mastodon found in all of New England. And on the other hand, the trophic level or the isotopic composition of its bones. And so this isn't like what it ate, as a young mammoth or a young mammoth. The way that collagen works in your bones is that as you eat different foods today, even as you're eating them, the collagen and the isotopic levels in your bones are remodeled on like a 3 to 6 month or year-long basis. So it's an indicator of what this mammoth was eating, at least within a year before it died. That's not true of the teeth. If you do it from teeth, you can see different things of when they were growing. But here, it's what the mammoth was eating before it died. And what it looks like is this mammoth was eating plants that a mastodon should be eating. Its isotopic composition puts it squarely within the food webs of a mastodon and not a mammoth. It is nowhere close to the elevated levels that you should see mammoths are eating, suggesting, as Sarah said, that it was probably very stressed and it was, eating things that we wouldn't expect. Now, there are lots of things animals do that we don't expect from paleontological perspectives, so sometimes I think we might overanalyze that. But the fact that its isotopic values fall within another individual, and also the type of vegetation that we expect to be here then. We expect the boreal forest then. We don't expect a lot of grasslands, right, in this area then. So the environment is changing. People are in the region. I think it's easy to imagine a scenario where these large animals are stressed, and that could lead to local extinctions. Of course, these animals survive a little bit longer in North America, but they do so in the very far reaches of North America and northern Canada. And they go extinct there in northern Canada a couple thousand years later. But again, the vegetation there is very different than it is in southern New England at this time or later, too.
So we find ourselves at the point that happens every month where we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we are running out of time.
Well, I'll just throw out something to really ruin everyone's day. The possibility that, we think of modern humans as hunters and big game hunters. I can see them scavenging a mammoth or a mastodon carcass, too. I mean, now, obviously, you wouldn't find bone points inside mammoth bones because of that. But
yeah, well, we know they did it with whales on the beach.
Right, so why wouldn't you do that with a big piece of meat?
I'm going to toss out a suggestion to listeners that if you ever want to take a youngster or the young at heart, because I find it fascinating. If you could go to, oftentimes Meigs Point Nature Center will host atlatl competitions, and to see Gary Knopf and company, I think the atlatl was one of the most fascinating inventions ever for someone, without any internet, without a chalkboard, without a textbook, to figure out, hey, this is how we can gain force and maybe a hunting advantage. I think it's fascinating. Anyway, be on the lookout for stuff like that.
Yeah, invented independently on every continent where there were people.
Unreal. Hey, can we make sure our listeners know how to find, follow, and be a part of your worlds?
Sure. You can follow the Office of State Archaeology on our Facebook page, and we have a webpage at osa.uconn.edu.
Yeah, FOSA, we have... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, no, sorry. Go ahead, Scott. Go.
FOSA, we have a Facebook page. You can also see us on the web at fosa-ct.org. And
there's a whole series of talks that the Avon Historical Society, among other many organizations in Avon, have created around the Brian D. Jones excavations, where you can learn a lot about the Paleo-Indian period and archaeology in Connecticut. And you can find that by Googling Unearthing History and Avon, Connecticut, and find that series that we've been doing this year, and it will continue for the next couple of years with additional talks by some great people.
Bye, everybody.
Hey, how about a part 2?
I'm in.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
Thanks.